France 24 with Laura Baines. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. This is the France 24 debate. We're looking at a new French probe into the Rwanda's genocide. During the break, Gérard Prunier, a fellow at the Atlantic Council, and Bernard Mengat, a Belgian attorney who's representing 7 people close to Paul Kagame, discussing the issue of whether or not it's easy or difficult to shoot down that plane that killed Rwanda's president, thus triggering the genocide. Also with us, and we welcome them back, Stephen Smith, who teaches at Duke University, and Linda Melvern, author of The Role of the West in Rwanda's Genocide. She is in London. We're talking about reactions to this ruling. The widow of Juvenal Habyarimana was in that Paris courtroom that you were in on Tuesday. Agathe Habyarimana fighting a long-standing extradition request from Kigali. Her attorney, cautious.
You know, it's very technical language. We just received today, we heard the conclusions of this 300-page report. Of course, we will study it in detail.
Technical language, difficult to read?
I don't think so. I think it's easy to read. The conclusions are very clear. And I'd like to come back to something. I represent, for instance, Mr. Frank Nziza, who is accused to have shut down, to have sent that missile. This man is accused to have been in massacre. He is accused on base of false information. Now, what we do with him? The question is, as a lawyer, as an attorney working in that file, that man is totally innocent because there is nothing in the file.
And there's still
And so the question is to dismiss or not to dismiss the file in favor of 7 people who were accused. And that is a major element.
When let's look at another reaction. And as you can see, they vary according to who you listen to.
To be honest, I think for a number of people, and certainly for the government, this is more vindication than exoneration, because we've known all along who was responsible for the plane crash, who benefited from the plane crash. Beyond that, we have seen a number of distortions and manipulations and cover-up after cover-up, and it all fits nicely.
Cover-up after cover-up. Gérard Prunier, do you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, the problem is it's like an onion. Once you take off a layer, there is another layer behind. So in the end,
but why,
you're back to square one.
A huge climate of suspicion, though.
Well, part of it is that, first, it's a French political problem. And then it's a problem for the UN and for the rest of the world. And it's there we have the onions. Because everybody feels he has to exonerate himself from some responsibility. The French from the accusation of being complicit in the genocide, the UN from having abandoned the victims of the genocide when they were being killed. So everybody is totally defensive. And it's fine that we have here an attorney whose job it is to be defensive, but I'm not an attorney. I'm not trying to prove that anybody is guilty or innocent. But what I'm saying is that it is not possible simply because you say missile was fired from point A rather than from point B, that we know now that the people who are accused are innocent and the people who are innocent are accused. It's not that simple, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry with that. I'm totally sorry, excuse me, because that is not the judicial manner to handle the file. When you have a judicial file, you have a lot of elements who are brought in the file. And on that base, there is an indictment or there is no indictment. And now, what I can say you is, frankly, there is nothing in the file against my clients. And that's the main question for me as attorney.
The main question is
there is no more witnesses, no more material element, and at that moment, after that, it's very simple to come here and say theoretically we can continue to make the game. But the question is, those 7 people falsely indicated.
Your clients might be completely innocent. It is quite possible. I'm sure of that. It does not mean that the political elements in the case are totally to be dismissed because your clients are innocent, which is definitely a possibility.
About the political element.
Let's broach this a little bit further here. On Wednesday, left-leaning daily Libération definitely chose its camp, screaming across its front page a headline that blared the words irrefutable. Irréfutable in French, with an editorial inside that says that the report finally restores the honor of a French justice system that this time refuses to bend in the face of an all-too-convenient excuse of national interest brandished by politicians from both the left and right over the years. The paper goes on to say, even though they're only partial, the report's conclusions allow to consider that the April 6, 1994 bombing as the starting point of a carefully prepared genocide under the watchful eye of Paris. Stephen Smith, do you think your former employers jumped the gun with that conclusion?
Very much so, and if I may, I would like to disagree on 3 counts. The first one is the report is very technical. It's 350 pages, and for example, if you look at one technical detail, which is even in the conclusion, you would find that it needs 60 hours of training and shooting roughly 50 missiles to be able to perform the job that was performed on that plane. This is an element that is quite important to take into consideration. So I disagree in saying that you don't need to read the detail, the fine print of the report to assess its importance. Secondly, it may well be that those who are indicted are innocent. That is very well possible. But I just, you have also to face the fact that the investigative magistrates in France gave themselves 3 more months to assess what the conclusions actually would be of the report. If it were so blank evidence as it was alleged, then they could have decided that the indictments should fall immediately. They didn't do so. This is an expert report which needs to be checked and counter-checked by other experts. I acknowledge that it is important, and I think everybody does, and so do the magistrate, but it's just a step in a long road. Thirdly, I do believe that Libération jumped the gun. I also think they were outrageously partisan in this issue. I have followed the story from 1998 onward, and I can tell you that Judge Bruguière, you can discuss his professionalism, that all is debatable, but it took him 8 years to publish the result of his inquiry, not because the political power of the day was so keen in having the result that they wished for, but rather the other way around. They didn't want to further complicate their relations with Rwanda, and so his report was ready in the early 2000s, and it took him almost 6 years to finally be able to release his report. So it's the other way around. It is not as if it were in the shadow of political pressure. He was very much his own man, which was part of the problem, maybe publicity seeking, but he was not being dictated by the French power of the time. They were trying to appease Rwanda and not to stir up the past.
All right. Nonetheless, Bruguière's investigation enough to spark a huge diplomatic row in 2006. Relations were strained to breaking point. 2 years later, President Kagame's chief of protocol arrested in Frankfurt as part of that investigation. She stayed in France for 4 months at the start of 2009 before the charges were dropped against her. The Rwandan government expressing outrage, even staging a counter-inquiry before a normalization of ties last year, which, despite experiences, still leaves sometimes something of a bitter taste.
It's a love-hate relationship. There's been a lot of hate, rivalries, misunderstandings, and so on. But now the people of Rwanda want to renew their ties with France. The Rwandan authorities have also come to realize it's an opportunity for them too.
Linda Melbourne, when you're in Rwanda, what's the feeling about that relationship between Rwanda and France?
I think you've rather glossed over it here, rather. This was France's dirty war. France knew more about what was happening in Rwanda than any other country, and I find it really strange that French officials and politicians were almost immediately so keen to blame the RPF for downing the plane. Don't forget, almost immediately that plane came down, the RPF, together with Belgian peacekeepers, were blamed for the crime. And as we know, the next morning, on April the 7th, 10 Belgian peacekeepers were murdered. This effectively got rid of the UN from Rwanda. And I think it rather strange, too, that one can look at the assassination of Habyarimana that night without following through with what happened the next day. Rwanda's political opposition was almost entirely wiped out in a systematic campaign. The head of the Constitutional Court, the Prime Minister, and then Hutu extremists in the military and politicians devised a new so-called interim government, which was in control during 3 months of genocide. And this interim government was accepted diplomatically in France. I don't think you can look at the assassination of Habyarimana in isolation. One more thing. Last year, I interviewed Gérard Prunier about this. My work continues. I've interviewed dozens, if not hundreds, of people about this. And he intimated to me that French mercenaries may have been involved in some of this. And I would like to know whether, in fact, he has gone to the Trevedic inquiry and offered any information he might know about it.
Gérard Prunier?
No, I'm afraid I don't know any more than what we discussed with Ms. Malvern at the time. I think where I have to agree with her is that it's simply not possible to disconnect the shooting of the plane from the events that followed.
I want to ask you about a character inside of all of this, someone who was lurking in the shadows. It was the then president, François Mitterrand's head of counterterrorism, a former gendarme by the name of Paul Baril, who, after being the head of counterterrorism, suddenly pops up in Kigali when all this is going on. What do we know about what he was doing there?
Well, first of all, he was not working for the French government anymore, but that he was involved is almost sure.
Involved in a public relations role or more than that?
No, he was very close to Mrs. Habyarimana.
He had a private security company.
Yes. Now, I will not speculate on what he did for her, but by all, it was well known that he was working closely with her. On what exactly? There are laws that prevent talking about such things when you don't have proof to back up what you're saying.
Stephen Smith, your thoughts?
Yeah, that's very simple. It's much simpler than presented because Paul Baril was specialized in putting up or organizing presidential guards all over Francophone Sub-Saharan Africa. He had been working not for Mrs. Habyarimana, but for President Habyarimana. So when Habyarimana was shut down, he contacted Mrs. Habyarimana, and she asked him whether he could in any way assist her. Then he flew through eastern Congo into Rwanda, retrieved what he thought was the black box of the. So he made a fool of himself because he brought back a black box that was not the flight recorder at all. He went on TV. So he had, he did a fool's job on that. And he was not in any conspiracy. He had been selling his services to other presidents. He had been trying to do so with Habyarimana, had some sort of relationship with him, and afterwards tried to get a foot into that inquiry because he saw the high profile of that affair, obviously, with a president or two presidents being killed. So it's a very simple story. I don't think he is a pivotal figure in this dossier at all.
Bernard Manguin?
Paul Baril was present before the crash, was present after, was consultant for Mobutu, was consultant for Mrs. Habyarimana, and I observed that even during the investigation, he gave some name to the Commandant Paibien, who is at the head of investigation, to have some translator who is a strong friend of Jean-Luc Habyarimana. And I observed that the missiles who were under his control in April disappeared in Congo when they went to Goma. If you are such a man with such capacities, it's not possible that it should disappear so quickly and so easily in Congo. I observed that the black box he said he had in his hands disappeared too. I observed that on the crash site, that was only the Rwandese people of a new government, interim government of Kabanda, were present during more than 6 weeks.
Right, but just
so to say you why no on that base with so many elements, nothing as investigation concerning Mr. Baril. Nothing. When I say nothing, correspondence, bank accounts, conversation, phone conversation, nothing
they should be pointing the finger at him more, you're saying. Linda Melvern, before we go, this latest report, is it going to help, in a sense, for what Gérard Prunier was alluding to earlier? Help in draw conclusions for the future for countries, not just France, as Gérard was saying, that feel uneasy, of course, about standing idle during the genocide?
No, I think this is just the beginning. I think this is really the beginning of what must now be a very serious inquiry. I think it behoves us all to try to understand how the Bruguière report came to be written, how it came to be based on such shaky testimony. It did not really bear scrutiny. I'd like to know why a group of French officers approached Lieutenant General Dallaire, who was the fourth commander of the peacekeepers, within hours of the plane coming down, and offering him an expert team that was apparently waiting in a neighbouring African country. There are so many questions. I'd also like to know what Grégoire de Saint-Quentin, the officer embedded in the Rwandan army, the senior French officer who was embedded in the army and who was in Camp Kanombe when the missiles were fired. He must have heard that noise, and he must have realized how close the missiles were. And yet Bruguière was allowed to produce a report that claimed definitely the missiles had been fired from Masaka. There's an awful lot that is very murky and very mysterious, and I think an investigation should continue. If not an investigative journalist, then I think perhaps some part of the French establishment.
All right, I want to thank you for joining us, Linda Melvern in London. I want to thank Stephen Smith for being with us from Duke University in North Carolina, attorney Bernard Mangin for being with us as well, and Gérard Prunier. And thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate. Coming up next, it's time for business, and that's hosted by Marcus Carlson.